Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
On Invest Africa today, we are unpacking Africa's rail sector. Hello and welcome. I'm Nozi Pombandra. Now, moving goods and people by rail is the cheapest, most efficient and most reliable way to do so, particularly on a continent as vast and underdeveloped as Africa. Over the past decade, major intra-African rail projects have kicked off, such as the Mombasa-Kigali Railway in East Africa. And this, of course, will link the port of Mombasa in Kenya with Tanzania and landlocked Rwanda as well as South Sudan. And we're also going to be looking at Prasa, which of course is the rolling stock program in South Africa that we know will be moving more than 2.6 million commuters daily. How does this fit into the broader rail picture? But before we get into it, let's take a quick look at this project known as Gibela.
Our main mission is to provide the train and the associated services in order to achieve the great challenge the Deputy Minister has just mentioned. So this is our vision, to be a catalyst player, allowing Prasa to make that great change. We know that nevertheless our challenge is not only to deliver train and maintenance activity, it's much more. Our mandate is also to revitalize the railway industry in the country, and given the magnitude of this contract, we will have also to provide a lot of initiatives in economic development for the country, jobs related, skill development, and a lot of other focused on blackboard-based enterprise.
And joining me now is Debay Scott. He's the Head of Infrastructure Advisory and Major Projects, this at KPMG, and Vishal Lachman. He's the Divisional Director in Development, Transportation and Infrastructure at WSP Parsons Brickenhoff Africa. Gentlemen, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Debay, let's start off by just getting a history of rail investment in South Africa and on the continent, and in particular trying to really understand why this renewed surge and focus on the sector.
Good morning. I think rail investment is, the word investment is really what it's all about. There's been a complete lack of that. South Africa per se goes back just on metro rail, doing the basic passenger transport, well over 40 to 50 years when the last previous major investments was made. So that's why the Gibela in it that you've just spoken about is so critically important. It's a well in excess of 100 billion rand program over 10 to 20 years that will be the first real public transport program on the continent. Now that's in South Africa, you know, a reasonably developed country relative to Africa. Those challenges are still faced, you know, north of us. So it's of absolute critical importance, the steps we've taken here on the passenger side,
right,
and on Transnet, on the freight side,
yeah, because
that drives economies. You know, the investment in certain of these corridors.
Absolutely, and I think you raised an important point, and perhaps, Vishal, we can pick up on this, especially as we're still looking at the broader landscape, the importance of rail infrastructure in economic development. Has this been sufficiently understood, and does it receive the priority that it should when it comes to economic planning at a national level?
I think it was always well understood. I think it is now that it has been prioritized. For many years, and again in keeping with what the base has indicated, I think that we all know the value of rail. It is now that rail has been prioritized in the capital programs of Prasa and Transnet. But
gentlemen, where did the step change come in? Because for a large portion of time, road has been, you know, attracting a lot of the freight business. Where did the step change come in? Is there a specific moment in time where we said this is when the switch happened and rail became important once more?
I think road, you're 100% right. Road has been and still is, you know, the primary transport sport. It's highly inefficient. You know, the more north you go, the more landlocked, you know, countries you do get. For example, the Zambia copper belt.
Yeah.
To take that copper into the export market takes a convoy over 20 days of traveling on the roads before they get to the market. So you can imagine what that does for the cost of that export. So it's all about eventually realizing if we want to be competitive, we want to be in the global space, we have to invest into the more efficient mode. So that, I think, is the trigger.
So Vishal, we're definitely hearing that this is in a recognition of efficiency and improving on the ease of doing business. But again, the other point I think Debase raised earlier was a lot of the investment is still in South Africa. And if we look at the rail network compared to the rest of the continent, most of it, at least 80% according to research, resides within South Africa. What does the picture in the rest of the continent look like?
I think, coming back to your question on the step change, I think that was an important point on how we realized that, for example, Transnet, if I use that as an example, has spent many years investing a lot of capacity in ports. In other words, ports are now the point of intermodal transfer of goods. In order to realize the capacities in all of the ports in the country, the rail had to come as a second initiative. So now, to complement the existing port capacities, rail has now been prioritized in order to balance the capacity of the various corridors in the country. And I think that is where the step change came from. The realization that the ports are now well equipped generally, and and rail will now have to be put into place to bring the volumes to the ports.
It's the concept of pit to port.
Pit to port.
Everybody talks about that. We are a resources continent. That's what we do. We don't really manufacture a lot, but we've got very rich resources, which we have to, as quickly as possible, as cheap as possible, get to its eventual customers. So that's why the ports and the mines and the rail, it's like a pit to port cycle, which is completely interlinked with each other. It's complex. It's not simple to get this all to work properly. It's very expensive. So that, I think, is the sort of realization that that's really what we have to do.
But you're also raising the interconnection with the resources industry that rail is highly dependent on for demand. And I want to go back to the point you raised, Vishal, about Transnet. You've put Transnet on the table, and we know that they have a very ambitious demand-led strategy. And lots of critics have come to the table and they've said, why would you put capacity before we've actually seen demand? What's your view on that debate?
My view is that the demand is, and the demand is based on how we forecast the future of the growth of the producers in the country. And they've done a lot of work around that in forecasting this demand. And in order for us to meet these demands over the next period, that's the next 30 years, we have to put the infrastructure and the planning into place at this time in order to meet those demands.
Let's also just look at, especially staying with Transnet, because it's really perhaps one of the biggest investments we've seen in the sector in a while. Who's really getting the pieces of the pie when it comes to the investment play and how's that cut up? Let me get your sense first, Vishal.
Well, at present, remember, when we do capacity planning as a country, we plan around what we have in place at this time. So when you look at the capital programs and the forecasting going forward, it would appear that the big players, for example, have the lion's share of the investments that are being put in place. However, I think that there is enough, or there is effort, or there's a very clear realization that there's a need for transformation, and there's a need for new entrants to enter this market. So
a clear realization, but is that realization translating into an actual equitable distribution of participation in these investments?
I think reality is that it will take time. I think Transnet has got what we call an industrialization, economic development program, which is earmarked at the established manufacturers re-establishing capacity in the country. Prasa has got a very intense program through Gabela in establishing a local passenger train capacity. The site has been identified. There will be a factory built in on the East Rand and Donater that will employ thousands of people, directly and indirectly, in building the capacity to build new passenger trains. So that's a 10-year program, and the whole idea being that there's a scaling up of how much of the investment of the country into this new fleet will remain back in the country, i.e. reinvested into that, and it's legislated. So I think South Africa has learned a lot of lessons on industrialization and how to build capacity, and I think we are slowly getting it right.
I want us to focus a little bit on passenger rail that you've just put on the table once again, Debase. In South Africa, there's a perception that's very different from if you're in another market like the UK, in particular London, where the usage of the tube is commonplace. How do we change the perception among South Africans that rail is a preferable mode of transportation? We've seen some step changes with the Gautrain, but is that sufficient, and can we make bigger changes?
Well, the Gautrain, for example, is so successful that it's right now in the midst of assessing additional coaches, as well as doing feasibility studies on new networks. So, you know, that would not have happened if it's not successful and if the demand's not there. I think the demand is absolutely clearly there for some alternative transports. Because, you know, if you just look at our highways and what they look like, and the log jams for, you know, the times are just expanding. Prasa, you know, has always been faced with the metro process that is not reliable, that's old, that is probably not that safe. Every now and then there are accidents. It's been said the new metro fleet will take double the amount of people at double quick amount of time. Now, even if that is roughly thereabouts, imagine the impact on the economy.
The new metro fleet, though, would it, in terms of affordability, because this has been one of the key criticisms that have been leveled against the Gautrain, that it's efficient, it's fantastic, but it does not really cater for the ordinary person in Gauteng who needs to access that kind of transport. Are we looking at something that looks at the mass market and that could possibly, Vishal, be you know, a real alternative for people who are not at the apex in terms of the income bracket?
I think at this time, it might appear that the Gautrain serves a different market. I think in time to come, and the initiatives that have been put in place from Prasa side, I think, again, it will take a little bit of time, but I think the strategies are accurate and correct in the way they want to transform their business. If you look at the new rolling stock, visually, very similar. So the quality and the levels of service for the new rolling stock, again, very similar. So I think in time to come, once it's rolled out and implemented, I remain very optimistic that it will start to attract a market and start to integrate different markets.
Well, on that point, we've just taken a look at a broad overview of rail in terms of freight and ended our conversation by looking at the passenger element of this conversation. Let's take a short break now, but when we come back, let's dig deeper into the financing of rail investment on the African continent. We'll see you in 2 minutes. Welcome back, and thank you for staying with Invest Africa. And still with me in our Johannesburg studios is Debase Scott. He's the head of infrastructure advisory and major projects at KPMG, as well as Vishal Lachman. He's the divisional director in development, transportation and infrastructure at WSP Parsons Brickenhoff Africa. Gentlemen, welcome back once again. Debase, let's start off with who's putting their money on the table when it comes to rail infrastructure. Who's funding these ambitious projects that we're seeing not only in South Africa, but that are crisscrossing the continent?
I think the answer to that is fairly simple. If you look at passenger transport, the metro transport, that's really the first entry level of basic transport for the blue-collar workers and the people who simply cannot afford it. That has always been and will always be a subsidized, government subsidized, heavily subsidized financing. It's the best affordability you can get on that. As you move a little higher into the users of the product, and the Gautrain starts to use, especially on the airport rail link, you know, you can see it in the price differentials as well. There, the users starts to, you know, fund these thing a bit more, but it's still heavily subsidized. So transport, Freight is a very different game, because freight has got the pit-to-port argument,
Yes.
the mining people who's keen to move the goods into the ports and into the export markets. All sorts of take-and-pay agreements prevail. Levies are being used in certain areas. So the financing of the freight products is a very different concept compared to passengers.
Let's focus on financing of freight as a starting point, and really also begin to understand here who are the players in the funding matrix. Are we seeing public-private partnerships coming to the fore, or is this still heavily reliant on the national purse?
I think we are slowly seeing PPPs coming to the fore. I think Transnet, in particular, who's the player in South Africa, has had such a strong balance sheet historically and still currently that it's got the internal capability of financing a lot of these with its own cash flows. So between some early degrees of PPPs at Transnet, but mostly their own internal cash flows, and then structured transactions, project finance transactions with the manufacturers on take-and-pay agreements to share the risks, and some of the ECA, global providers that back imported goods. So it's a whole package that's quite complex. The only one that's reasonably simple are the passenger ones that's straight government funded.
That's straight government funding. I want to touch on project finance with you just for a moment, Vishal, because this seems to be perhaps one of the key vehicles that are being levied or used to address rail investment infrastructure deficits on the continent. In a project finance deal on the African continent generally, are we finding that there are viable projects for project finance to latch onto, or is there an issue of viability that we're seeing?
I think with regard to passenger, there will always be an issue of viability. Again, in keeping with what the base has indicated. Typically, globally, these are always subsidized transport systems. However, seeing that we also have an opportunity to link freight to passengers, there is possible opportunities to integrate these two systems, similarly to South Africa, to integrate these two systems to further assist and make passenger more viable.
So, of course, and I think that's a very important point that you put on the table, this capacity to integrate so that we improve viability. But I want to talk about integration from a different angle, Debase, and this is integration at a regional level where you have multiple governments who are involved in ensuring the viability and the financial viability, really, of projects coming to fruition. What's the ease of doing that on the African continent right now, especially if we're looking at the coordination of their regional policies and the like?
The unfortunate answer is not easy. That's why it's not happening that quickly. It's difficult to do it. These things are expensive as well, and it's very important to look at where is the offtake markets. And the classic offtake markets for the Africa continent are mostly east-based. The Indias, the Chinas, and whatever. Yes. So that favors the investment more on the eastern side of the continent. So for clear and obvious reasons, and that's why they are developing the way they are. Your western side of the continent has got other challenges. Right. There's been the Botswana-Walvis Bay linked rail freight link, the Trans-Kalahari, 1,500 kilometers, so you're always faced with vast distances as well. And to get a return on your investment of taking coal out onto the west side, take it to your eastern customer base, is tricky. Yeah. So the whole thing on the continent, it's a big place. A lot of the richer resources are more in the middle of the continent, almost so to say. Zambia, the DRC is meant to be one of the richest parts of the continent. That's completely in the middle of the continent. So to move anything away from there becomes a real challenge.
And we'll touch on challenges a little bit more, because on the one hand you're raising the geographic location of the natural resources, but we know, especially if we look at the DRC, even a market like Mozambique, there are political challenges as well, where rail becomes the instant target for a lot of the political instability. But I quickly want to talk about, staying with the regional picture, Vishal, the importance of leadership there, especially when it comes to making sure that the regional agenda supersedes the national ambition of a particular country. Do you get a sense that there's been significant stepping up of African leaders to fill that particular vacuum, if I can call it that?
I cannot get that feeling at this point in time. I think coming back to the leadership, and again what the base has indicated, our paradigm still remains that we will need to build these systems to export to foreign markets.
Yeah.
And I think that's where perhaps there's an opportunity to relook at these things. The intra-Africa trade, for example, again, coming back to what you mentioned, is an opportunity to explore a lot further. Perhaps we are not exploring it a lot further because of these tensions.
Right. And is it an institution like the African Union, perhaps, or should we be looking at regional economic communities to be taking the lead in this regard? Who's supposed to fill the leadership vacuum that we're seeing?
I think the African Union can play a very strategic role in bringing these policies to become congruent, let's put it that way, so that we start to thinking as a region as opposed to competing as countries. And I think the geographic borders really need to fade away in order to actually do these systems and and to exploit the markets optimally.
So, Debase, you're nodding. Are you saying that we should get rid of the borders as we know them as well?
Just before we get to the borders, one fantastic lesson we've learned in South Africa is major projects, and these are all major projects, will not happen if there's not the political champion or real leadership pushing them. Now, if you look at the Transnet, Brian Molefe's influence, and you look at Prasa, Lucky Montana's influence, and the respective ministers there, these were priority projects, that's why it's happening. We find a lot of these projects, if the leadership is so key, if there's not political championing or leadership pushing these projects, it becomes another project.
Is the Transnet project at risk now that Brian Molefe has since been deployed to Eskom?
I don't think so. I think the Transnet structure is much more than just Brian. I think he's got a very competent group of people. And once you press the button on these projects, it's like a 4-5 year cycle between the ports and the wagons and the pits and the quotas and all of that. So it becomes almost irreversible. It rolls.
So would you agree then with maybe something that I'm reading from a comment that Vishal made earlier, that in order to make sure that even leadership changes at a ministerial level don't have a significant impact on what's been agreed on, we actually need to couch and house these projects within regional institutions and continental institutions so that we have that long-term play and we have a window that surpasses an administrative change in any one country?
I think leadership on the governmental level has got lesser of an influence, but they're the original champion. You need to get the project going with a prominent leader at that point. Once it's picked up momentum, it's much more important the operational leadership. It moves one level down. For the continent, I would say the continent needs traction. It needs action. It needs examples. It needs to see a successful Transnet. It needs to see Prasa's all facilities are successful. And I think both those entities have expressed their desire to go north and to use their ability though, and that I think will build traction.
How do we tell that story more effectively? Because there's clearly lots of work being done and we're seeing it playing out in the transactions that are taking place. And if looking at global best practice, or in this particular case, continental best practice is going to be a key way of us doing that. Are there sufficient platforms to share these stories on the African continent? What do you think, Base?
I think we are famous in this country, and I've been saying this a long time, for only talking about the negative aspects. You know, we don't celebrate what we've achieved at all, almost, you know, because it's just simply not spoken about. Now, these are massive platforms, and there are many other industries of platforms that's also been created that sets the scene for SADC to start to get benefit from that. There are platforms within SADC from a advisory capacity to try and facilitate. So there are many things happening behind the scene which is just generally not known. And I think we need one of the things, simple things we need to do, like Brian Molefe was doing the other day with his new plan at Eskom, to share the light of some of the future. We need to tell the people what are we doing and what is the outcomes of what it's going to do. Where's the good story? We just don't like for some reason to share good stories.
So one part of what to do next, if we take what Debase is saying, is to tell the good stories and to share the best practice examples. Vishal, if there were levers that you could move to allow the continent to move at a faster pace when it comes to investing and realizing the benefits of investing in rail, what would that be?
You know, it comes back in my mind to the unlocking of congruent leadership in the region. A lot of the dialogues we should have locally. A lot of these solutions will affect and have legacy impacts on all of these countries for many generations to come. And I think it's important to appreciate that. So when we look at moving forward rapidly, we always have to have a little bit of caution in terms of what is the legacy we are going to leave behind in pushing for different projects, and what are the agendas that we all have as people looking from the outside into a country, or people that are in a country looking outside. So I think it's important, there's a few lessons we have learned, where engaging with society at large, engaging with people, whether these projects actually do benefit them. And it should not be pushed by financial agendas, for example. It should not be pushed from engineering agendas or from off-takers' agendas. Because remember, it really sits within these countries, and I think we have to always be respectful of that and the legacy that would be impacting them over time, and let that be the source of where the projects come out of and the approvals come out of, so that leaders can then implement it, because leaders are really representatives of the people.
Well, I must say I did not expect a conversation about rail investment to dovetail into legacies and leadership, but it certainly has. A very big thank you to my guests for bringing their insights to the table, and that's Debase Scott, is the Head of Infrastructure Advisory and Major Projects at KPMG, and Vishal Lakshman, Divisional Director in Development, Transportation and Infrastructure at WSP Parsons Brickenhoff Africa. For myself and the team, it's goodbye.